We were 3 days into tearing out a one-room schoolhouse in the mountains of West Virginia when the crew boss put his crowbar through what he thought was a rotten section of subfloor, and the whole thing swallowed the bar. Not cracked, swallowed. It went down into a black space under the children's room that the county said did not exist, that the deed said did not exist, that the man who sold us the building swore on his father's grave did not exist. And when we finally got a light down into that hole, the first thing it caught was a ring of carved stone. And standing up out of the centre of that ring was something that no schoolhouse in America has any business sitting on top of. This is the story of what we found under that floor, and why, when the county heard about it, 3 different people who had lived in that hollow their entire lives suddenly decided they had never heard of the place. My name does not matter for this. What matters is the schoolhouse and what was sleeping underneath it, and the fact that the official history of that little town is a lie so old that the people telling it have forgotten it was ever a lie at all. Before we go one step further, do one thing for me. Down in the comments right now, type the name of the oldest building in your town, the one nobody can quite explain, the courthouse that is too big for the county, the church with the foundation that goes down farther than it should, the school your grandmother swore was haunted. Just the name. Type it and leave it there, because by the time we climb back out of that chamber together, I promise you are going to look at that building in a completely different way. Go ahead. I will wait. Now let me take you back to the morning we drove up into that hollow before any of us knew what we were parking on top of. The town, if you can call it that, sits at the end of a gravel road that the map still marks as a state route, even though the state gave up maintaining it sometime in the 1960s. There is a general store that closed before I was born, a Baptist church with a fresh coat of paint over 100-year-old logs, maybe 40 houses scattered up the hollows, and the schoolhouse. I am not going to give you the real name of the place, and you will understand why before we are done. Call it Ashby Hollow. Call the school the Ashby District School. That is close enough to the truth to matter, and far enough from it to keep certain people off my porch. I do architectural salvage. That is the polite term for it. What it actually means is that when an old building is going to be torn down anyway, people like me come in first and take out everything worth saving. The heart pine flooring, the hand-forged hardware, the wavy old window glass, the chestnut beams that you cannot buy anymore at any price because the tree that made them has been functionally extinct since the blight came through a century ago. There is real money in it if you know what you are looking at, and after 22 years of doing this, I know what I am looking at, or I thought I did. The job came to us through a development company out of Charlotte. They had bought up a big parcel at the head of the hollow, the schoolhouse included, and they wanted the old building gone so they could put in some kind of retreat, the sort of thing where people from the city pay to come feel rugged for a weekend. Standard job, salvage first, then a demolition crew behind us to knock down whatever was left. We were told the building went up in 1891, that it had served as a 2-room school until 1952, and that after that it had been a Grange Hall, a polling place, and finally nothing at all for the better part of 40 years. That was the story on the paperwork. 1891. Remember that number, because that number is the first thread, and once I started pulling on it, the whole thing came apart in my hands. Here is the thing about a backwoods schoolhouse from 1891. It should be simple. It should be poor. These were dirt-poor mountain communities putting up a building with volunteer labour and whatever timber they could fell and whatever stone they could drag out of the creek. You expect rough sills sitting on a few piers of stacked fieldstone. You expect a crawl space you can barely fit a dog under. You expect the whole thing to be about as sophisticated as a good barn, because that is what it was. That is not what we drove up to. The Ashby District School was built out of cut ashlar stone at the base, the kind of dressed and squared block that takes a trained mason weeks to produce, laid so tight in places that I could not slip a knife blade between the courses. The corners were true. The window openings had proper cut stone lintels and sills, not the sawn wood you see everywhere else in that county. And the foundation, which is where this story really begins, did not stop at the ground. When we scraped back the soil along the north wall to get at the sill plate, the stone kept going down. And down. We dug a test pit at the northeast corner just to find the footing, the way you do, and at 4 feet we had not found the bottom of the wall. At 6 feet we had not found it. At 8 feet we hit water and quit, and the wall was still going, still perfectly coursed, still true, disappearing into the dark of the pit like it had been built by people who expected the ground level to be a whole story higher than it is now. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the pattern you are going to see again and again before we are done. A one-story schoolhouse, poor, remote, thrown together by farmers in 1891 according to the paper, sitting on a foundation of dressed stone that runs at least 8 feet below the current grade and does not stop. That is not a foundation. That is a buried first floor. Somebody built something taller and grander than a schoolhouse, and then the ground came up around it, or was brought up around it, and what was left sticking out of the dirt got a roof slapped on it, and a new date painted over the door. I did not think all of that on the first day. On the first day I just thought, that is a lot of stone, and I filed it away the way you file away anything that does not fit, and I went to work on the inside. The inside is where it stopped being a curiosity and started being something else. We pulled up the top layer of flooring in the main room, the wide old boards, beautiful stuff, and underneath it there was a second floor, not a subfloor, a finished floor, older, harder, a different wood entirely, laid in a herringbone pattern that no volunteer farmer in this hollow ever laid in his life. Somebody had covered a fine old floor with a plainer one, the way you would hide something you did not want seen. And when we got into the smaller room, the north room, the one that the old teacher's logs we found in a closet kept calling the children's room, the floor did not sound right when we walked on it. It sounded hollow, deep hollow, the kind of hollow that means there is a lot of empty space under your feet. We pulled a board in the corner of that room to see what was under it, and there was no crawl space, and there was no dirt. There was a step, a single cut stone step, dressed and worn smooth in the middle the way stone gets worn only by a great many feet, over a great many years, and below it another, and below that a third, a stairway of dressed stone going straight down into the foundation of the building, packed solid with reddish clay that somebody had rammed in there by hand to seal it off. 9 steps we could count before the clay swallowed them. 9 steps going down under the children's room of a schoolhouse that the county swore up and down had no cellar, no basement, no lower level of any kind. 9 steps that somebody had gone to enormous trouble to fill in and floor over and forget. That was the end of the first real day, and that night, back at the motel 40 minutes down the mountain, I pulled up the county records on my laptop, and that is when the second thread showed itself, and it was worse than the first. Before we move on to the county records, stop for a second. What you just heard about the sealed stairwell under the children's room is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original building survey. 9 stone steps, the rammed red clay. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The county has its deed records online now, scanned images of the old handwritten books, and I have spent enough nights in enough motels chasing down the history of enough old buildings that I can read those books about as fast as I can read a newspaper. So I went looking for the Ashby District School. I found it. 1891, just like the paperwork said. A deed transferring 1 acre from a family named Ashby to the County Board of Education for the purpose of erecting a schoolhouse, $1 and other good and valuable consideration, signed and witnessed and recorded. Clean, ordinary, exactly what you would expect, except the deed describes the transfer of the land. It does not say a single word about building anything on it, and the very next entry in the book, recorded the same week, is a payment from the county to a stonemason, not for building a school, for, and I am quoting the exact words, repairs and alterations to the existing structure. The existing structure. In 1891, the year the official story says this schoolhouse was born, the county was already paying a mason to repair and alter a building that was already standing on that acre. The school was not built in 1891. Something was already there. 1891 is just the year they papered over it and called it a school. So I went hunting for the older records, the ones that would tell me what the existing structure actually was, and this is where I hit the wall that I think a lot of you have hit. If you have ever tried to dig into the real history of your own town, the records are gone. The county courthouse burned in 1879. Of course it did. There is always a fire. Half the courthouses in Appalachia have a convenient fire somewhere in the 1870s or 1880s, right at the seam where the old history should connect to the new. and every single time the fire takes exactly the records that would tell you what was there before. The land grants, the original surveys, the tax rolls that would show a building generating value long before anyone admits a building existed. All of it ash. What survives is what got recorded after the fire, and after the fire the story starts clean, with new dates on a new page in a new hand, describing a poor little mountain community that supposedly built its first real structures in the 1890s. But the fire missed one thing, because the fire always misses one thing: the graveyard. Up behind the church, on the slope, there is a cemetery, and the oldest legible stone in that cemetery is dated 1844. That is a problem, and here is why. If the official history is right, if this hollow was barely settled wilderness until the 1890s, then who was being buried under carved marble headstones in the 1840s? Somebody was living there and dying there and burying their dead under proper cut stone, 2 full generations before the town admits it existed. And when I walked that cemetery myself, later, I found stones older than 1844. Stones with the dates worn smooth, deliberately or by weather I cannot say, but the style of the carving, the winged faces, the willows, that is 18th century work. That is the 1700s, in a hollow that supposedly had nobody in it until 100 years after that. I sat in that motel room until 2 in the morning going in circles, and I kept coming back to the mason's bill. Repairs and alterations to the existing structure. Whatever the Ashby District School really was, it was old before it was a school, it was grand before it was poor, and somebody in 1891 had spent county money not to build it, but to change it, to alter it. And I could not stop thinking about those 9 stone steps under the children's room, rammed full of clay, and the question that would not let me sleep. What do you alter a building to do when the alteration you are paying for is to bury the way down? The next morning I did something I do not usually do. I got to the site early before the rest of the crew, alone, and I stood in that empty children's room in the grey light coming through the bricked-over windows, and I listened. I do not know what I expected to hear. Nothing, probably. But that room was cold in a way that the rest of the building was not, a wet cold that came up through the soles of my boots from the sealed stairway below. And standing there in the quiet, I had the first genuinely unpleasant feeling of the whole job. The feeling that the emptiness under that floor was not empty. That is not a rational thing to say, and I am not a superstitious man. 22 years of crawling around in the guts of dead buildings will knock the superstition right out of you. But I stood in that room, and I did not want to be in that room, and when the first truck rolled up the gravel outside, I was more relieved than I want to admit. I made a decision that morning that I have gone back and forth on 100 times since. I decided we were going to dig out those steps, not because the job called for it. The job called for us to strip the salvage and get out. But because I had to know, and because in this business, the good stuff, the stuff nobody else has, is usually behind the thing that somebody went to a lot of trouble to seal. I told the crew we had found an old cellar and there might be some ironwork worth pulling down there. That was a lie, or at least it was not the whole truth, but I did not have the whole truth yet. What I had was 9 steps and a bad feeling and a bill from a dead mason, and by the end of that day we had a great deal more than that. Digging out a stairway that somebody has packed solid with clay is miserable, slow work. You cannot use a machine because you do not know what is under you, so it is buckets and hand trowels and a lot of cursing. That clay had been in there a long time. It had gone hard as fired brick, and it came out in chunks that held the shape of the tread so perfectly that when I turned one over I could see the wear pattern of the steps pressed into it like a fossil. The whole first day we managed maybe 6 more steps, 15 total now going down, and the walls of the stairway on either side were that same dressed ashlar stone, close-fitted, and about halfway down on the left-hand wall, one of my guys, a young fellow named Dale, called me over because he had scraped the clay off something that was not stone. It was a handprint, pressed into a patch of mortar between 2 blocks, at the height where a man would steady himself going down the stairs, and above it, cut into the stone itself, worn but unmistakable, was a symbol. A circle with a line through it and 3 smaller marks radiating off the line, like a diagram of something or a letter from an alphabet none of us knew. Dale asked me what it was, and I told him I did not know, which was true, and I told him it was probably a mason's mark, which was a guess, and a bad one, because I have seen 10,000 mason's marks, and they are simple things, a chisel and a square, an initial, a date. This was not that. This was deliberate, and it was strange, and it was placed exactly where every single person descending those stairs would put their hand and see it, right at eye level, right where you could not miss it. It was a thing you were meant to touch on the way down, and I did not want to touch it. That evening I drove down into the hollow proper, to the little cluster of houses, because I wanted to talk to somebody who actually remembered the school. It took me a while to find anyone willing. There is a particular way that old mountain people go quiet when you ask about a certain thing, and I got that quiet from 3 different porches before I found a man named Halsey, 91 years old, sharp as a tack, sitting on his porch with an oxygen line in his nose, who looked at me a long time before he decided to talk. I told him I was working on the old Ashby school. He said, "I know what you are working on." I said, "Do you remember it?" And he laughed, not a happy laugh. And he said, "I remember they shut it in the fall of 1952 and sent every child in this hollow down the mountain to the consolidated school an hour away on buses the county could not afford, in the middle of a school year, with no explanation, and nobody around here ever asked why out loud, because everybody already knew why, and knowing why was not the kind of thing you talked about." I asked him why. He looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "They found the little Combs girl in the low room. That is what they called the north room," he said. The low room. Because the floor of it was lower than the rest, a step down, before somebody floored over it level. They found her in the low room during recess, sitting on the floor in the corner facing the wall, and she had been in there alone maybe 10 minutes, and when the teacher shook her she did not stop what she was saying, which was the same 3 sounds over and over, and she never did really stop, Halsey said. She lived to be an old woman down in a home in the valley, and to the end of her life, if you got her tired or scared, she would start up with those same 3 sounds. And that was the day, he said, that the parents in this hollow decided no child of theirs was ever going to spend another hour standing on top of whatever was under that floor. So they shut it, and they sent the children away, and the county wrote down that the school closed due to consolidation, and that was that. I asked him what he thought was under the floor. And this is the part I have thought about more than anything else that man said. He did not say a demon, he did not say a devil, he was a church-going man his whole life, and I expected the church-going answer. Instead he said, "My grandfather helped fill in the stairs. In 1891, when they made it a school. He was a boy, and he carried clay in a bucket for 2 weeks, and he told me once that they did not fill in those stairs to keep the children out of the cellar. They filled them in to keep what was in the cellar from coming up the stairs at night, the way it had been coming up, he said, since before anybody in this hollow was born." Halsey looked out at the mountains, going blue in the dusk, and he said, "You should put that clay back where you found it, son, and drive on home." Then he went inside, and he did not come back out, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. Because when I went back 4 days later to ask him more, the house was empty, and a cousin told me he had passed in his sleep the night after I visited. Make of that what you will. I have made too much of it, probably. But I will tell you that when I got back to the site the next morning, I stood at the top of those 15 exposed steps for a long time before I told the crew we were going to keep digging. Halsey's voice was in my head the whole time. Put the clay back. And I did not put the clay back. I have to live with that. It took us the better part of 3 more days to clear the rest of the stairway, and I want to describe what we found at the bottom because it is the thing that finally convinced me that the story we had been told about that building, about that town, about the whole shape of the history of that part of the country was not just incomplete, it was inverted, upside down, a photograph of the truth printed in reverse. There were 31 steps in all. Count them. 31 dressed and worn stone steps descending in a slow curve, because the stairway was not straight, it turned as it went, the way a stair turns around the inside of a tower, except this one was turning down into the earth instead of up into the sky. And at the bottom of those 31 steps there was a door, not a wooden door, not the plank and iron of a root cellar. It was a slab of iron, riveted, easily 4 inches thick, set into a frame of the same dressed stone, and it had been sealed shut not with a lock but with lead. Someone had poured molten lead into the seam all the way around that door to fuse it to its frame, the way you would seal a coffin you never intended anyone to open, the way the old churches sealed the crypts of people they were afraid might not stay dead. Now think about what that means in terms of pure labour and pure intent. To seal that door, somebody in a dirt-poor mountain hollow had to smelt lead, carry it molten down 31 steps in the dark, and pour it into a seam around a 4-inch iron slab, and then, on top of that, fill the entire stairwell above it with hand-carried clay, 1 bucket at a time for 2 weeks, according to Halsey's grandfather. That is not the effort of people sealing off a damp cellar. That is the effort of people terrified of something. People who did not trust 1 barrier or 2 barriers, but wanted 3, wanted the door and the lead and the clay and the floor over the top of it all, wanted layer on layer between the hollow and whatever was on the other side of that iron. You do not do that to keep water out. You do that to keep something in. And here is where I have to pull the camera back, because to understand what we eventually found behind that door, you have to understand the thing that people in my line of work whisper about, but almost never say out loud. And that is that the official history of the buildings in this country does not add up. It does not add up in 1,000 small ways that each look like a coincidence, until you have seen enough of them, and then they stop looking like coincidences and start looking like a pattern, and then the pattern starts looking like a cover story. I have salvaged courthouses in county seats of 3,000 people that have the stonework and the domes and the proportions of European capitals. Buildings that we are told were designed and built in a couple of years by a single local architect nobody had ever heard of before or since. Buildings that no town of 3,000 farmers could have paid for or staffed or filled. I have been in the sub-basements of state hospitals and asylums, enormous stone complexes, we are told, house the mentally ill, that have miles of vaulted tunnels and furnaces the size of houses and networks of iron piping. For something that was never electricity and never plumbing as we understand it. I have found, over and over, the same thing we found at Ashby. Buildings whose foundations run a full story too deep, as if the ground came up around them. Windows at the base of walls half buried that once looked out on a lower world. Whole first floors turned into basements by a rising tide of earth that the history books never mention. A flood not of water but of mud and soil that seems to have come across a great deal of the world at more or less the same time, and then quietly become the new ground we all walk on. The people who look into this call that event the mud flood, and they call the thing that came before it the old world, and they call the moment when the old world ended and the new story began the reset. And I will be honest with you, for most of my career I thought that was nonsense. Cranks on the internet drawing lines between old postcards, but you cannot dig a test pit at the northeast corner of a mountain schoolhouse and watch a wall of perfect ashlar disappear 8 feet down into groundwater, without something in the back of your mind going very quiet and very cold, and saying, what if the cranks are looking at the same thing I am looking at right now, and what if they saw it first? When I got back to my laptop that night, I pulled up the oldest survey map of the town that survived the fire, a hand-drawn thing from the 1880s, and I looked at the way the streets were laid out, and I felt the floor drop out of my stomach, because the roads of that hollow, the ones that are still there, the ones we had driven in on, do not follow the creek and the ridges the way a mountain town naturally grows. They radiate, they come out from a central point in straight spokes, and they are crossed by roads that curve to meet them. And when you trace the outermost of those curving roads, the whole thing resolves into a shape, an 8-pointed star, a geometry that has a name because you see it in the old fortifications of Europe and in the plans of cities that were built all at once by people who understood mathematics we pretend the frontier never had. A star fort, that dead-end mountain hollow, that nothing town at the end of a gravel road, is built inside the ghost of an 8-pointed star fort, and the Ashby School, the building we were standing on, sits dead in the centre of it, on the exact point where all the spokes converge. Whatever that building was, it was not built to be a school. It was built to be the centre of something. And 31 steps below the children's room, behind 4 inches of iron and a seam of poured lead, was the reason. I did not tell the crew about the star fort. I did not tell them about Halsey either, not the part about what came up the stairs at night. I told myself I was keeping the morale up, keeping the job moving, but the truth is I was ashamed of how much of it I had started to believe, and I did not want to say the words out loud in the daylight and hear how they sounded. What I told them was that there was an old sealed door at the bottom of the stairs, and that behind old sealed doors in old buildings like this, you sometimes found the good stuff, the church silver, the ironwork, the things that got hidden and forgotten, and that we were going to open it. Half of them thought it was a great idea. Dale, the young one who had found the handprint, did not. Dale said, and I remember this exactly, he said that in his grandmother's church they had a saying, that some doors are shut by better men than you for better reasons than you will ever know. I told him to get the grinder. Breaking that lead seal was the single most reluctant hour of physical labour I have ever supervised. Not because it was hard. Lead is soft, it grinds away easy, it came out of that seam in bright curling ribbons that fell and coiled on the steps like something alive. It was reluctant because every man on that stair could feel it, the wrongness of it, the way the air coming through the widening crack in the seal was not the flat dead air of a sealed cellar, but something with a smell to it. And I have spent my life smelling the insides of sealed buildings, and I have never smelled anything like what came up through that seam. It was not rot. Rot I know. It was not damp or mould or animal. It was dry, and it was old, and underneath it there was something almost sweet, a smell like a struck match, like the air right after lightning, like hot iron and something burned a very long time ago that had never quite finished burning. It came up out of that crack, and it filled the stairway, and every one of us stopped and looked at each other, and nobody said anything. And then I told Dale to keep grinding, because if I had let the silence go on 1 second longer, I think we all would have walked up those stairs and never come back, and part of me wishes to God I had. The door did not swing open. It fell inward. When the last of the lead let go, it went in one piece, all 4 inches of iron, and it hit the floor of the chamber beyond with a sound that was not a clang. It was a flat, dead, enormous thud, the sound of iron hitting packed earth, except it was not earth, and it took me a while to understand what it was, and when I did understand it I had to go sit down on the steps for a minute. The floor of that chamber was not stone, and it was not dirt. The door had landed on a thick, dense, blackened layer of something soft and compacted, and the reason it did not ring like iron on stone is that iron on stone is a clean sound, and this floor was not clean. This floor had been fed. But I am getting ahead of the moment, and I want you to be in the moment with me, standing at the bottom of 31 steps in a dead schoolhouse, in a dead hollow, looking through a doorway that a whole community sealed with lead and clay and terror, into a room that no living person had seen in 130 years. So let me tell you exactly what the light showed us in the order that it showed us, because the order matters. It is the order in which the truth of that place got into me, one piece at a time, and each piece was worse than the last. The room was round, or rather it was 8-sided, an octagon, the same 8-sided geometry as the star fort the whole town was built inside, as if the town were only a diagram of this room, a huge chalk drawing on the surface of the earth, pointing down at the real thing buried underneath it. The walls were dressed stone, close-fitted, rising to a domed ceiling, and set into those walls at regular intervals, at about the height of a standing man, were iron staples, heavy ones, hand-forged rings and loops bolted deep into the stone, and I counted them, and there were 13, spaced around the 8 walls, in a pattern I could not immediately read, and worn smooth and bright on their inner curves in a way that iron only gets worn when something has pulled against it, hard for a very long time. I did not want to think about what had been chained to those rings. I made myself not think about it, and I stepped down off the last stair into the chamber onto that soft black floor, and I lifted the light, and I saw the centre of the room. And that is the image that I will carry to my own grave. That is the thing I saw first that told me with total certainty that whatever the Ashby School had been built on top of, it was not a cellar, and it was not a crypt, and it had never in its long life been anything as harmless as either. In the centre of that octagonal room the floor rose into a low platform, a single course of stone, and cut into the top of that platform was a ring, a perfect circle grooved into the stone about the width of my 2 hands across, and inside that ring was a second ring, and inside that a third, 3 concentric circles, like the ripples a stone makes when it drops in still water, frozen in rock. And running out from that centre, cut into the floor in straight lines, were channels, narrow grooves no wider than a finger, carved into the stone and running from the central rings outwards toward the 8 walls, 1 channel for each wall, like the spokes of the star fort again, like the roads of the town again, the same shape repeating and repeating from the scale of a whole valley down to the scale of a groove you could hide with your hand. And those channels were dark. They were stained a deep brown black that had soaked so far into the stone that it was part of the stone now, and they ran downhill very slightly from the centre to the walls, and at the base of each wall, where a channel ended, there was a small round basin cut into the floor. And I understood then, standing there, what the channels were for, and what had run in them and where it had gone. And I am not going to describe it any more plainly than that. You already know. You have known since I said the floor had been fed. Rising from the exact centre of the 3 rings was the stone. I keep calling it a stone because I do not have a better word. It was black, and it was roughly the height of a kitchen table. And it was not shaped like an altar the way you picture an altar, a nice flat slab. It was shaped more like a seat, or a throne, or the stump of something that had been much taller and had been broken off, and its surface was not smooth. It was carved, every inch of it, top to bottom, in the same strange marks we'd have found on the stairway wall, the circle with the line and 100 variations of it, and other marks that were not that. Marks like letters, and marks like little diagrams, and marks like nothing at all, packed so tight and so deep that the whole stone seemed to crawl in the lamplight when your eye tried to follow them. And I will tell you that when Dale finally came down the last of the steps, and stood beside me and put his light on that stone, the first thing he said in a small voice was, "Those are not English." And I said no. And he said, "Those are not any language." And I said, "No, Dale, I do not think they are." And neither one of us said the thing we were both thinking, which is that they were writing, real writing, meant to be read, and that meant that somewhere once there had been someone who could read them, and that whoever that someone was, they were the ones who built this room, and they were not us. They were not the farmers of the Hollow, they were not the county, they were nobody in the history we have been given, and their writing was down here under a schoolhouse, and it had been down here a very long time. Above the stone in the dome there was a hole, a round shaft cut clean through the stone of the ceiling going straight up, and I traced it in my head against the layout of the building above us, and I realized with a kind of sick lurch that it lined up. That shaft went straight up through the buried old floor and the newer floor above it, and it came out, or it once had come out before it was floored over, in the exact centre of the children's room, the low room. Whatever happened on that central stone, in that ring of channels under those 13 iron staples, it happened directly below the spot where, for 60 years, small children sat on the floor at recess. They floored over the shaft, they did not fill it. They put a board across the top of a hole that went down 31 feet into a room full of iron rings and blood channels and unreadable writing, and they let children sit on that board. And I thought about the little Combs girl sitting in the corner of the low room facing the wall, making 3 sounds over and over, and I thought she was not looking at the wall. She was as far from the centre of the room as she could get. She was sitting in the corner because she had felt the shaft under the floor, and she was trying to get away from it, and she was 10 years old, and no one understood, and she made those 3 sounds for the rest of her life. I have gone back and forth for a long time on how much of what I felt in that room was real, and how much was a grown man scaring himself in the dark after too little sleep and too much of Halsey's story in his head. I want to be fair to you. I want to be fair to the truth, so I will say it plainly. There was a pressure in that room, not a sound, not a smell, a pressure, a sense of a great and patient attention, the exact feeling you get when you are certain someone is standing behind you in an empty house. Except it did not come from behind me, it came from below me, from under the black floor, from under the stone, from deeper than the room itself, as if the chamber was not the thing, as if the chamber was only a mouth, and the thing it belonged to went down and down into the mountain past any depth a man with buckets and trowels was ever going to reach. And every single one of us felt it. I did not tell them to. Nobody planted the idea. But one by one, without a word, every man in that room ended up standing with his back to a wall, facing the centre, facing the stone, the way you face a dog you are not sure of, and we stood there in a ring around that thing in total silence, and the lamps hummed and the black floor drank the light, and none of us wanted to be the first one to move. Dale was the one who broke the silence, and he broke it by being sick, quietly, in the corner by the stairs, and the sound of it snapped us all out of whatever had settled over us. And I did the foreman thing. I got loud and practical. I said, "All right, everybody up top, we are done for the day." And I meant it. I meant to clear that room and think about it in the sunlight. But you know how it is. Once the spell breaks, curiosity comes flooding back in behind it, and by the time we were halfway up the stairs I had already decided that I was going back down alone to document the place properly. because whatever else this was, it was the find of my career, and no salvage man alive walks away from a sealed chamber without, at least, taking pictures. So I sent the crew up and out, and I went back down with a good light and my phone, and I spent about 40 minutes down there alone, and that 40 minutes is the reason I do not sleep well anymore. The black floor, when I finally made myself crouch and look at it closely, was layered, season after season of it, pressed down into a substance more like peat than soil, and worked into that substance, half swallowed by it, were things I made myself photograph and then made myself stop photographing. Small bones. Not human, I told myself, animal, and some of them were surely animal, the offerings of 100 desperate years, but not all of them were animal. And I am not a coroner, and I did not dig, and I am not going to pretend I know things I do not know, but I know the difference between the skull of a lamb and the thing I found near the base of the central stone, and I put the light away from it, and I did not photograph it, and I have tried very hard to forget the shape of it, and I cannot. The walls above the iron staples were covered in marks that were not the old carved writing. These were newer. These were scratched, gouged, clawed into the stone by hand, by many hands over many years, and they were tallies, counts. Little groups of lines scored into the rock the way a prisoner marks the days, hundreds of them, thousands, and here and there among the tallies there were words, real words in English, in the shaky, desperate hand of people scratching in the dark. I photographed those, and I have read them more times than is good for me. One said, "It does not sleep, it only waits." One said a name, a girl's name, and under it, "Forgive us." And one, low on the wall, near the floor, where someone must have been crouched or kneeling or worse, said only, "We did not build it, we only feed it, and if we stop it, will feed itself." That one is scratched deeper than the others. Whoever wrote it pressed hard. And here is the thing that took the last of the ground out from under me. The thing that made me understand that the reset the internet cranks talk about is not a theory about architecture. It is a theory about a crime, and that the crime is ongoing. Set into one of the 8 walls, at chest height, there was a stone that did not match the others, a paler stone clearly placed later, a repair, an alteration, and carved into that paler stone in clean, sharp letters that had not had time to weather was a date. It was not 1891. It was not 1844. It was not the 1700s of the oldest gravestones. The date carved into that repair, in that sealed room under that schoolhouse, was a date I recognised because it was inside the span of my own grandfather's life. Somebody had been down in that chamber doing masonry, patching that wall, well into the 20th century, decades after the county swore the stairs were filled and the school was built and the whole thing was finished and dead. The seal we broke was not the original seal. Somebody had opened that room and used that room and resealed that room long after the Hollow supposedly gave it up. The clay and the lead we ground through were not 130 years old. They were the most recent layer of a thing that this valley has been opening and opening again for longer than any of the histories we are allowed to read. I climbed out of that chamber for the last time as the light was going, and I did not know it was the last time, and I stood in the low room, the children's room, with the shaft sealed under my feet, and I called the development company in Charlotte to tell them what we had found, because that is what you are supposed to do. You report a significant historical or archaeological find, work stops, the proper people come. I got a voicemail. I left a long, careful message. And the next morning, everything about that job and everything about that town and everything about the people who had hired us changed so fast and so completely that I have never been able to prove to anyone that any of it happened at all. The call came at 6 in the morning before I had even left the motel. It was not the man I had left the voicemail for. It was a woman with a flat, pleasant, corporate voice who introduced herself as being from the legal department of a company I had never heard of, not the development company, a different name entirely. And she thanked me for my report and told me that the site had been reclassified, that our salvage contract was terminated effective immediately, with full payment for the entire job as agreed, that a specialised team would be handling the remainder of the work, and that per the terms of the contract I had signed, which she was happy to email me a copy of, all findings on site were the confidential property of the client, and I was bound not to photograph, document, publish, or discuss them. She was very calm. She used my full legal name twice. She mentioned in the same pleasant tone the address of my house, not as a threat. She made very clear it was not a threat, just as confirmation that they had my correct contact information on file. And then she wished me a safe drive home and hung up, and when I looked at my phone, every photograph I had taken in that chamber was gone. I want to be careful here because this is the part where I lose people. This is the part where it starts to sound like a story a man makes up. So let me only tell you what I can stand behind. The photographs were gone from my phone and from the cloud backup that syncs automatically, and that I have never once managed to fully turn off. Whether that is something a legal department can do, I leave to you. When I drove back up to the site that morning anyway, because I am stubborn and I was angry, the gate at the head of the hollow that had stood open and rusted the entire time we worked there was closed, and new, and chained, and there were 2 vehicles parked inside it that had not been there the day before, and a man in a plain jacket walked down to the gate and did not open it, and told me, politely, that this was now a private work site, and that my contract had concluded, and that he was sure I understood. He knew my name too. He knew what I drove. And behind him, up the hollow, I could see that the schoolhouse already had scaffolding on it, gone up overnight, and something that looked like a drilling rig, and men moving with the unhurried competence of people who do this all the time, who have done this in 100 hollows, who came the moment the flat, pleasant woman made her calls. I went to see Halsey, and Halsey was dead. I went to the 2 other porches where people had gone quiet on me, and one house was empty with a for sale sign already in the yard. And at the other, an angry younger man I had not met told me his grandmother had never lived there, and I should get off the property and never come back. And this was a house I had stood in front of and spoken to an old woman on 4 days earlier. I went to the county office to pull the deed and the mason's bill again. The ones I had read on my own laptop, and the online records were down for maintenance. And when they came back up 2 weeks later, the entry for the mason's bill, the repairs and alterations to the existing structure, was not there. The deed was there, 1891, clean, ordinary. But the line that proved something older had stood on that acre was simply gone. And when I told the clerk it had been there, she looked at me with a face I have seen before, the face of someone who has been told what to say and does not enjoy saying it. And she told me she did not know what I was talking about, and I believe that by then she genuinely did not. Here is what they cannot take, though. They took my photographs, but they did not take my memory, and they did not take the one thing I did that I have never told anyone until right now. When I was alone in that chamber for those 40 minutes before I climbed out for the last time, I took one small thing. I did not mean to steal a historical artifact. I did not think of it that way. I saw it lying half in one of the blood channels near a basin at the base of a wall, and I picked it up because it was small and strange, and I put it in my jacket pocket without really deciding to, the way you pocket an interesting rock on a hike. And then everything happened, and I forgot it was there until 3 days later at home, when I put that jacket on and my hand closed around it. It is a small disc of some dark metal, heavier than it should be, cold in a way that metal that has been in your warm pocket should not stay cold. And it is carved on both faces with the writing, the crawling writing from the stone, and there is a hole through it as if it was meant to be worn, and I have it still in a box in a place, and I will tell you honestly that I have thought many times about driving it back up into those mountains and throwing it off a ridge, and I have never done it, and I do not fully understand why I have never done it, and that not understanding is its own kind of answer that I try not to look at directly. After I got home, after the anger burned down into something colder and more useful, I did what I should have done years earlier in my career, which is I started really looking. And I started talking to the other men who do what I do, the salvage men and the demolition men and the old restoration masons, the ones who have spent their lives inside the bones of these buildings, and I asked them a careful question. I asked whether any of them had ever come across a sealed lower chamber under an old public building. And I want you to understand what happened when I asked, because it is the single most convincing thing I can tell you. They did not laugh. Not one of them laughed. Most of them went quiet in a way I recognized, the Halsey quiet, and then, one at a time, in bars and on job sites and over the phone late at night, they told me their versions of the same story. A man I have known for 15 years told me about a county courthouse in Ohio, a building far too grand for the town it sits in, that has a sub-basement the county does not have keys to, with a door the same as ours, iron sealed, that a maintenance crew was ordered never to open and that the older janitors would not speak about. A restoration mason in Pennsylvania told me about an octagonal room under a Masonic hall, walled off with the same channels in the floor that he was hired to seal, not to open, to wall up more permanently by men who came from out of state and paid in cash and watched him work and took his tools apart afterward to make sure he had photographed nothing. A demolition contractor told me about an old asylum in the Midwest. One of those enormous stone hospitals, we are told, were built to warehouse the insane, that had a network of these chambers connected by tunnels, one under each wing, all sealed, all identical, all centered under the rooms where the most vulnerable people in the building had been kept. And he told me that when the state finally demolished that asylum, they did it in a hurry, at night, and they did not let the salvage crews in first, which anyone in my business will tell you is not how it is ever done, because there is too much money in the stone, unless somebody has decided that keeping people out is worth more than the stone. And when I laid a map of the stories out, the ones I could verify a location for, and I put them next to the maps of the star forts, the 8-pointed geometries that sit under so many of our cities, that once you see them you cannot stop seeing them, and next to the maps of where the mud flood evidence is thickest, the buried first floors, the windows at sidewalk level, the whole drowned old world, the 3 maps were the same map. The chambers are under the star forts. The star forts are in the mud flood zones. And the mud flood, the reset, whatever ended the old world and buried it and started the clean new story on a fresh page after a convenient fire, did not bury these chambers by accident. It buried them on purpose. It buried them the way you bury anything you are afraid of, deep, and then it built a school on top of one, and a courthouse on top of another, and an asylum on top of a dozen more, and it put over each one the kind of building that guarantees a steady, quiet, unremarkable supply of exactly the thing that the men scratching on the walls of that chamber were so afraid of stopping. And once you accept that the placement is deliberate, a second thing follows that is even harder to carry, which is the question of timing. Because these buildings did not all go up in the same decade, the courthouse in Ohio and the hall in Pennsylvania, and the asylum in the Midwest and the schoolhouse at Ashby span better than 100 years of official construction dates. If the chambers were only relics of one lost old world, one single reset, then they would be uniform, buried once and left. But they are not left. They are maintained. There is fresh masonry in them, fresh seals, fresh dates carved inside my grandfather's lifetime, which means that whoever tends them has been continuous across all of those decades, generation after generation, quietly making sure that every time a town needed a new courthouse or a new school or a new hospital, it got built in the right spot, over the right shaft in the right shape, by an architect nobody remembers, on the foundation that was already there. That is not the footprint of a single ancient catastrophe. That is the footprint of an institution that never stopped, that has been laying its diagram over new towns for as long as there have been new towns, hiding the oldest thing in the world inside the newest buildings we have, so that we would trust them and use them and never think to look down. I do not know who they are. I want to say that clearly because the honest answer is the scariest one, and I am not going to insult you by inventing a name and a symbol and pretending I have it figured out. I do not know if it is one organization that has lasted 500 years, or a habit that gets passed down like a family recipe, or something older and simpler than either. A thing that people do near these chambers the way animals do things near a certain kind of ground without ever quite deciding to. What I know is that in 1891 somebody paid a mason to alter an existing structure and fill in a stair. What I know is that decades later, inside my grandfather's lifetime, somebody carved a fresh date into a repair in a wall 31 steps below a schoolroom full of children. What I know is that the morning after I reported it, a company I had never heard of had my address, my vehicle, and my photographs, and a crew and a drilling rig staged and ready before dawn, which is not the behaviour of people who were surprised. It is the behaviour of people who have a plan for exactly this, who have run this play many times, who know precisely what to do when some salvage man with too much curiosity grinds through the lead and reports a significant historical find. They were not surprised by my chamber. They were only surprised that I was the one who found it, and they corrected that surprise inside of 12 hours. And if I had not pocketed that cold, heavy disc without thinking, I would have nothing at all. And I would probably have half convinced myself by now that I imagined the whole thing. I did try, once, to find out what the writing said. I took clean photographs of both faces of the disc, careful ones, good light, and I sent them, without telling him where they came from, to a man I found through 2 or 3 careful introductions, a man who spends his life with old and dead and undeciphered scripts, the kind of quiet expert who has read languages that have not been spoken in 3,000 years. I told him I had found the images in an old family collection, and I asked him only whether he recognized the writing system. He wrote back quickly, and his first email was excited, professional, full of questions, asking where the artifact was, whether he could examine it in person, telling me the script was unlike anything in the standard catalogues, but that certain of the characters showed structural similarities to scripts far older and far more distant from these mountains than anything that has any business being carved on a disc from a schoolhouse in West Virginia. He was thrilled. He thought he had a discovery. And then I made the mistake of sending him one more photograph, the wide shot, the one that showed the disc lying on the black cloth I keep it in. And something in that image, I still do not know what, changed everything. His next email was short, and it was different. He asked me very directly where I had gotten the object, and he asked whether there had been a structure, a room associated with it, an underground room, and he asked whether it was octagonal. I had told him none of those things. I had said an old family collection. He knew. He knew it came from a chamber, and he knew the chamber was 8-sided. And the only way he could know that is that he had seen this before, or had been taught about it, or had been warned about it. And when I did not answer right away, he sent one more message, the last one, and it said only this. It said, "Do not bring it into your home if it is not already there." It is already there, isn't it? And it said, stop photographing it, stop looking at it, and if you have begun to hear it, and you know what I mean by hear it, then you need to understand that you have less time to decide what to do than you think. And then he stopped answering. Every email after that bounced. The introductions that had led me to him went cold, and I sat with my one photograph and my cold heavy disc and the thing he had asked me, if you have begun to hear it, and I thought about the little Combs girl and her 3 sounds, and I did not sleep at all that night, and I have not slept a whole night through since. Because the honest truth, the truth I have not said out loud to a single living person until this recording, is that yes, I have begun to hear it. Not with my ears, it does not come in through the ears. It is 3 sounds, and they come when I am tired or frightened or just at the edge of sleep. 3 sounds in an order, always the same order, and I have never repeated them to anyone, and I never will, because I have come to believe that the sounds are not a symptom of having been in that room. I have come to believe that the sounds are a name, and that the worst thing a person can do with a name is say it, and that the men who scratched "forgive us" into the wall of that chamber knew the name and said it once when they had to, when the feeding was due, and I will die before I say mine. I know how that sounds. I have heard how it sounds every time I have played this back, and I have thought seriously about not putting this out at all, about burning the disc and the photograph and the notes and going back to pulling heart pine out of dead farmhouses and never thinking about star forts or mud floods or octagonal rooms again. But I keep coming back to the map, the 3 maps that are one map. The chambers under the schools and the courthouses and the asylums under the exact rooms where we keep the ones least able to protect themselves, the children and the accused and the mad, all across a country that we are told was raw wilderness until the day before yesterday. That is not a story about my one bad job in one dead hollow. That is a story about the ground you are standing on right now, and about the building at the heart of your own town, the old one, the 2 grand one, the one nobody can quite explain, the one whose name I hope you typed into the comments a long time ago, back at the top of this before you understood why I was asking. I went back up there one more time about 8 months later, when I could not stand not knowing what they had done with it. The gate was open again by then, rusted and ordinary, as if it had never been chained, and I drove up the hollow with my heart going hard, and where the Ashby District School had stood there was a building, a new building, a big handsome lodge of timber and stone, the retreat the Charlotte Company had always said they were going to build, with a gravel lot and a welcome sign and a row of little cabins going up the slope, and it sat exactly where the school had sat, on the exact centre of the star, and I walked up onto the porch of it like any curious traveller, and I looked in the windows, and I understood the whole thing at last. And it was worse than a cover-up, because a cover-up at least ends. They had not filled in the chamber. I am as sure of that as I am of anything, because the new lodge was not built beside the old footprint or over a cleared lot. It was built directly on top of the old foundation, that same ashlar stone I had watched disappear, 8 feet into the groundwater, reused, incorporated, the deep old walls now serving as the deep new walls, and at the heart of the lodge, where the great room was where they would gather the guests around a big stone fireplace. The floor was a poured slab, and I would bet my life that 31 steps under that slab, the iron door is back in its frame, freshly sealed, and the channels are waiting, and the 13 staples are waiting, and the black floor is hungry after its long interruption. And now, instead of children at recess, there would be a steady, quiet stream of tired strangers from the city, coming and going weekend after weekend, sleeping directly above it, paying for the privilege, feeding it in whatever way it is fed by simply being there, alone, at night, at the centre of the star, none of them ever knowing what the pleasant staff and the flat, pleasant voice on the phone have always known, that the whole beautiful rustic retreat is a lid, a fresh, clean lid, painted and furnished and lit, screwed down tight over the same old mouth. I did not go inside. A young woman in a fleece vest came out onto the porch and asked brightly if she could help me, if I was checking in, and I said no, I was just admiring the building. It looked old. Was it historic? And she gave me the practised smile and the practised answer. She said the lodge was brand new, but built in a heritage style, that there had once been an old schoolhouse on the site from 1891, but sadly too far gone to save. 1891, the clean date, the date on the fresh page after the fire. She said it the way you say a thing you have said 100 times and never once thought about. And I looked at this pleasant young person standing on a porch above 31 steps of dressed stone and a lead-sealed iron door and a room with a name scratched under the word forgive, and I realized she did not know. She truly did not know. She was not part of it. She was just a girl in a fleece vest with a summer job, standing on the lid, smiling. And that, more than the bones or the channels or the staples, is the thing that has stayed with me. Not the ones who know and seal it and feed it on purpose. The countless ones who do not know, who live and sleep and work and raise their children directly on top of it, who tend the front desk of the thing, who would look at you like you were insane if you told them, and who are, every one of them, exactly as safe as the little Combs girl was, sitting in the corner of the low room facing the wall, 10 years old, as far from the centre as she could get. I drove down out of that hollow for the last time, and I have never gone back, and I never will, but I made myself a promise on the way down, and this recording is me keeping it. I promised that I would tell it once, all of it, plainly, to as many people as would listen, not because I think it will do any good, not because I think anyone can dig up every star fort in the country and pour concrete down every shaft, but because those men scratched their tallies and their names and their confessions into the wall of that room in the dark for someone to find someday, and reading their words was the loneliest thing I have ever done, and the least I owe them, the very least, is to not let the thing they died feeding go on being fed in perfect silence. There is one more thing I chased down, and I almost did not tell you about it, because it is the piece that took this from a strange job to a wound I carry. I went looking for the Combs girl. Halsey had given me enough, the family name, the low room, the year, and I have spent enough time in old records to find a person if she was ever written down, and she was. Her first name was Ada. Ada Combs, born in the spring of 1942, in that hollow, enrolled at the Ashby District School, and there is a gap in the record in the fall of 1952, the exact season the school was closed and the children sent away, and after that gap her name reappears not in a school roll but in the intake ledger of a state institution down in the valley, admitted at the age of 10. And there she stayed, in one facility or another, for the rest of her long life, until she died an old woman in the 2000s, having outlived, as far as I can tell, every single person who ever knew what happened to her in that room. And here is the detail that I cannot put down. The state hospital where Ada Combs spent most of her life, the one they sent her to, is one of those enormous old stone asylums I described to you earlier. I did not realize it at first. I only realized it when I was cross-referencing my map of sealed chambers against the list of institutions, and I saw the name, and I felt the whole thing close around me like a hand. They took a 10-year-old girl who had felt the thing under the floor of the low room, who could not stop making the three sounds, and of all the places in the world they could have sent her, they sent her to a building that has the same chambers underneath it. They moved her from the top of one mouth to the top of another. I do not think that was an accident. I have stopped believing in accidents where this pattern is concerned. I think that is simply where you send someone who has begun to hear it, not to be cured, to be kept close, to be kept the way you keep anything that has been marked near the thing that marked it, And I think about the men in fleece vests and the flat, pleasant voices and the crews with drilling rigs staged before dawn. And I think they have a place for people like Ada. And I wonder, in the parts of the night when the three sounds come, whether they have a place for people like me, and whether the reason no one has come to my door is that they already know I will never say the name, that I will keep the disc cold in its box and my mouth shut, that I have effectively sealed myself, poured my own lead, and become no threat to anyone at all except the one man I used to be, who thought that the history in the books was the history that happened. So let me leave you with the part that I cannot prove and cannot shake, the part that is mine to wonder about, and now yours too. Everything we are taught about how the old buildings of this country came to be rests on a story that falls apart the moment you put a shovel in the ground next to one of them. We are told that dirt-poor frontier communities in a decade or two, with hand tools and volunteer labour, raised courthouses and schools and hospitals of a scale and precision and permanence that we, with all our machines, do not bother to match today. We are told the foundations run one story too deep because of frost or drainage or the whims of a forgotten builder, and never because the ground itself came up around them in an event no history book will name. We are told the fires that took the early records were accidents, everyone in every county at the same convenient seam of years. We are told the 8-pointed stars under our cities are old military engineering, decorative, coincidental, and never that they are the surface diagram of something that goes straight down. Each of these is a small thing you can explain away alone. But I have stood at the bottom of 31 steps under a schoolhouse, in an octagonal room with blood channels cut toward 8 walls and 13 iron rings worn smooth by pulling, and a name scratched under the word forgive. And I am here to tell you that when you have seen the real thing with your own eyes, the small explanations stop working all at once. And what is left is a shape, a pattern, a design laid over this entire country and probably the world, hidden in plain sight inside the most ordinary buildings we have, the ones we trust the most, the ones we hand our children to. I am not asking you to believe me. I know better than that. I am asking you to do the one thing that they cannot stop, the one thing that is free and quiet and yours. Go look at the old building in your town, the 2 grand courthouse, the church whose foundation runs deeper than the walls above it. The old school everyone always said was haunted, the wing of the hospital that is always cold, the lodge or the hall or the asylum with the sub-basement nobody has the keys to. Look at how deep the stone goes. Look at the shape of the streets around it from above. Look at the date over the door, and then go up to the oldest graves in town and find the ones that are older than that date, the ones that should not exist. You do not need a shovel. You do not need to grind through any lead. You only need to look at what is already there, in the open, waiting, the way it has been waiting under all of us the whole time. And once you have really looked, you will understand why an old man with an oxygen line told me to put the clay back and drive on home, and you will understand why I did not, and you will understand exactly what it is going to cost me that I told you all of this instead. If you made it this far, all the way to the bottom of the stairs with me, then you are not a casual viewer, and you already know that this is not the only building, this is not the only hollow, and Ashby is not the only name that got painted over a fire. There are others. I have the maps, I have the stories the other salvage men told me, and I am going to walk you down into them. One sealed chamber at a time on this channel, and I would rather not do it alone in the dark. So, subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next building I take you into is bigger than a schoolhouse, and it is not at the end of a gravel road in a forgotten hollow. It is in the middle of a city you have heard of. It is one you may have walked past, and what is sealed underneath it is not sleeping the way the thing at Ashby was sleeping. According to the men who sealed it, it never has. I will see you down there. Watch the ground.